On November 29th, General Smith ordered Colonel Homer Litzenberg, commanding the 7th Marine Regiment at Udamni, to break out to Hagaru. One battalion attacked cross-country and broke through the Chinese block at Toktong Pass, while the bulk of the two battalions pressed down the road. Steep hills and ridges lined both sides of the road. The Chinese fired from the high ground, wounding or killing numerous Marines, destroying transports and temporarily blocking the road. The Marines independently solved problems as they arose, such as clearing wreckage in the road, assisting wounded men, and engaging the Chinese. In the daytime, U.S. Marine Corps Corsair fighter bombers napalm, strafed, and bombed the hillsides. Through their combined efforts, the column trudged forward. On December 3rd, the vanguard of the column entered Hagaruri. As the Marines gathered at Hagaruri and prepared for their 11-mile trek to Kotori, Major General Oliver Smith was approached by an Air Force general. The general had flown into the Marines' forward command post to coordinate an aerial Dunkirk, in which 1st Marine Division would be evacuated, minus their equipment and weapons. This wasn't the first time Major General Smith had heard such an offer. On November 30th, General Almond had also urged 1st Marine Division's commander to head for the sea immediately, leaving behind anything that would slow them down. Once again, Smith provided both generals with the same answer. "We'll fight our way out as Marines, bringing all our weapons and gear with us." On the morning of December 6th, the 1st Marine Division was ready to break out of Hagaruri. Reaching Kotori meant traveling through 10 miles of Chinese-controlled roadway in sub-zero temperatures.
We were not equipped for it. We did not have, although I had summer underwear and winter long johns, Marine Corps dungarees, windbreaker trousers on top of my dungarees, and a field jacket on top of my dungaree jacket. I had a calf-length imitation fur-lined parka on, and still never got warm in 15 or 16 days there. I honestly thought we was all going to freeze to death.
On December 6th, Smith used the 1st Marine Division to spearhead the withdrawal through Kotori along a single narrow supply road that stretched 56 miles back to Hamhung. If the Marines were going to overcome these daunting conditions, along with the thousands of Chinese soldiers that stood between them and Hungnam, they would need air support. The commander of 1st Marine Air Wing, Major General Field Harris, devised a cover plan that would see the Marines through to their final destination. Every day, Marine fighters would fly directly over Smith's advancing columns, while Navy and Air Force fighters would provide further support. The Air Force pilots were especially effective at disrupting Chinese reinforcements and supply lines. With their aerial support in place, 1st Marine Division still had to deal with one major obstacle before leaving Hagaruri. East Hill overlooked much of the Marine supply route between Hagaruri and Kotori. Whoever controlled East Hill would also have command over the road south. The Chinese had also recognized the hill's strategic value and sent a battalion to hold it at all costs. If 1st Marine Division had any chance of breaking out, they would first need to dislodge the Chinese from East Hill. The task of taking East Hill fell to 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, who had just arrived from Udamni. At 0900, the Marines began their attack. In the Shajian Reservoir Campaign's bloodiest battle, Marines managed to dislodge the Chinese defenders only after 15 hours of non-stop fighting. As midnight approached, however, the Chinese prepared for a massive counterattack to retake the hill. Nightfall meant that Marine air support would have returned to their bases, leaving the Marines atop East Hill completely isolated. Aside from relying on their superior numbers, Chinese soldiers used psychological tactics to defeat their enemies.
Well, I did hear bugles and I heard whistles, but with my company, I mostly remember the whistles, that they had a system worked out where they could control their troops by the way they blew the whistles.
Shortly after midnight, East Hill's crest lit up with gunfire as the Chinese began their attack. Wave after wave of Chinese soldiers crashed into the Marine lines as both sides fought desperately for control of the hill. Despite sustaining heavy casualties, 2nd Battalion 5th Marines held on until the following morning, when Marine Corsairs returned to pound the Communist forces. There would be no more counterattacks at East Hill. As daylight revealed the previous night's carnage, Lieutenant Colonel Murray remarked that he saw more enemy dead on East Hill than he'd ever seen in one place before. With East Hill now secure, 1st Marine Division was cleared to begin their arduous journey to Hungnam. Early on December 7th, the first elements of 1st Marine Division departed from Hagaruri. For Major General Oliver Smith, who was traveling by helicopter, the journey to Kotori took only 10 minutes. It would take his Marines nearly a day and a half.
The 7th Marines started out, punched a way out of there, and the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, my regiment, or my battalion, followed them. But we didn't get to follow them close by because an airplane had come over, got knocked out, was smoking, had to land, and they decided that the airplane would have to be burned, and it was getting dark around 4:30 or a little after in the afternoon, and they kept my battalion inside the perimeter, and at daylight next morning the demolition people burned the plane, and we started south then. The 5th Marine Regiment followed us south.
As the Marines made their way along the snow-covered road, they passed by dozens of wrecked U.S. vehicles, a lasting memento of Task Force Drysdale. Chinese soldiers had set up several strong points along the Marines' path in hopes of stalling their advance. On the first 10-mile leg, Smith's 14,000 Marines and infantry fought off 4 CCF divisions, losing only 100 killed, 500 wounded, and 7 missing. After the Marines broke through these barriers in several brief but intense firefights, PLA soldiers changed their tactics. Instead of engaging the Marine riflemen, they would lay low and wait for the support troops who provided an easier target.
What had happened, we just started shooting at anything that moved because we had really no land because we were moving, okay. You set up a defense line when you know where your enemies are. But when you fight like that, you got to hit anything that moves. Here we are, we had two things against us. First of all, we were low on ammunition, that's number one. Cold weather, number two. And literally cut off from our main source of supplies, number three. Okay, supplies coming down to us, when they dropping to us, they were dropping, and the Chinese was getting them. So what they done, the only way we get our supplies was they dropped what they call a dummy drop. The Chinese went for the dummy drop, and then they dropped our supplies again. So they made 2 drops to us so we can get one. The first one, it was just empty cases and whatever, and let the Chinese go for it, and which they did, and left us to be prepared for the second drop to come down. Now that was communication with us. Now sometimes helicopters would come by over us and drop information to us, tell us, the point we need to go to, where we need, how we get out of there, and what route we need to take, maps, and where the enemy was the strongest, if they were, and one other thing they had done, that not only got behind us, they had built in artillery, they had tanks behind us, and the whole bit. So here we are trying to, find ourselves back, step by step.
Despite being attacked almost constantly and having to bypass many roadblocks and blown bridges, the Marines, with 2,300 U.S. Army soldiers, 150 Royal Marines, 40 South Korean policemen, and over 1,000 vehicles, arrived in Kotori late on December 8th. During their march, the Marine column had sustained another 616 casualties. As Chesty Puller, still in command of the base at Kotori, struggled to find accommodations for his new guests, Chinese heavy mortars were preparing to open fire upon the now crowded Marine base. General Smith knew that his men would have to continue their advance immediately if there was any chance of reaching the sea. On December 9th, shortly after the Marine column left Kotori, another problem developed.
We went down through Kotori, got about a half mile south of Kotori, and we had orders to G Company. My company went to the right of the road up on top of a peak on top of the hilltop or mountaintop. Part of my battalion went to the right of the road, part went to the left of the road. And I believe we spent 2 nights on top of that hill. We came off late in the evening, getting ready to go south. We got word after we got on the road, got ready to go, that a bridge had been blown just at the top of the mountain, that we had to go over to the top of the mountain.
The Chinese had blown up an important bridge 3.5 miles south of Kotori. Faced with a steep drop on one side and a cliff on the other, the Marines could find no acceptable way of bypassing the deep gorge. Without the equipment or time necessary to replace the bridge themselves, Marine engineers would collaborate with the Air Force. After making some quick calculations, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Partridge and his Marine engineers determined they would need 4 sections of 2,500-pound steel treadway bridge. Knowing that many things could go wrong during this kind of operation, the following morning Partridge had Air Force pilots drop 8 treadway bridge sections over the Marine position. During the drop, one section was damaged and another fell into Chinese hands. Still, with 6 sections remaining, the Marine engineers were confident they could construct a provisional bridge. After engineers successfully laid out the bridge's base, Air Force pilots returned to drop plywood panels. These panels would be on top of the bridge, allowing both men and vehicles to cross. When the bridge was nearing completion, a bulldozer lost control and caused what some believed to be irreparable damage. Once again, the Marine engineers pulled off what can only be described as an early Christmas miracle and managed to save the bridge. After the bridge was completed, 1st Marine Division was still left with the difficult task of moving their forces across the gorge. Tanks were left with barely an inch of leeway on either side as they drove across the bridge. If drivers made even the slightest deviation from their course, they were liable to fall through the center gap. Even though the operation was both stressful and time-consuming, the Marines managed to get their entire force across the bridge. The last senior officer to leave Kotori was Chesty Puller. He was followed by a contingent of Marine engineers who set about destroying the bridges that had been so carefully constructed earlier that day. Before 1st Marine Division could reach their next objective at Chonghong-ni, they would have to pass through the heavily defended Funchilin Pass. With the Marines making steady progress toward Hongnam, Chinese forces massed to make a last stand to block the breakout. Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China, ordered General Song Shulin to reinforce the Funchilin Pass with 2 additional divisions. Located halfway between Kotori and Chinhongni, the Funchilin Pass was the last natural barrier before reaching Hongnam. If PLA forces had any chance of stopping the Marines, they would need to do it at Funchilin. When Lieutenant Colonel Donald Schmuck led his battalion of Marines from Chinhongni to clear a path for General Oliver's Marines, he not only discovered that Chinese soldiers had claimed the high ground, but also that they were there in strength. Among Schmuck's men was Captain Robert H. Barrow, a tall Louisianan who would one day become the Marine Corps Commandant. When he was later asked about his first impression of the PLA position at Funchilin Pass, Barrow replied, "They were clearly in a position to control, dominate, and absolutely stop the 1st Marine Division from moving south. They had to be dislodged." This monumental task would fall to Lieutenant Colonel Schmuck's Marines. General Field Harris ordered his Corsairs to soften up the enemy position for the attacking Leathernecks. Marine pilots flew over the pass's 4,000-foot high ridge tops, dropping both bombs and napalm. Just when Marine pilots appeared on the verge of driving the Chinese divisions out of Funchilin Pass, a violent snowstorm broke out. Faced with howling winds and blinding snowfall, General Harris was forced to call his Corsairs back. The Marine riflemen would have to dislodge the remaining Chinese by themselves. Colonel Chesty Puller ordered his southernmost battalion to lead the charge by clearing Hill 1081. As with East Hill at Hagaruri, Hill 1081 was critical to their success because it dominated the main road and several bridges. If the PLA soldiers were not dislodged quickly, they would be able to pick apart the 1st Marine Division. Puller's battalion approached Hill 1081 from Kotori as 2 additional Marine companies attacked from the opposite side. For once, the North Korean winter worked in the Marines' favor. Under the cover of snowfall, Captain Barrow's Able Company could ascend Hill 1081 undetected and overwhelm the Chinese strongpoint. Recognizing that they were in jeopardy of losing Hill 1081 and Funchilin Pass with it, the PLA soldiers launched a series of counterattacks to regain their position. The fighting was fierce as both sides tried desperately to take control of Hill 1081. In one instance, Chinese infantry rushed a tank and succeeded in killing the crew. At Okinawa 5 years earlier, 1st Marine Division had prided itself on being the only U.S. division to not lose a tank during an infantry assault. The Marines at Funchilin were not happy at having broken this tradition and promptly took their frustrations out on the offending PLA soldiers, literally tearing them limb from limb. Both sides incurred heavy casualties. Many companies saw their numbers shrink drastically.
They literally crawled right up in our foxholes. And I had just taken a San Francisco Marine Reserve around to our company's command post. Each of us get 2 boxes of ammunition. And before we could get back to our machine gun, all hell broke loose. I could hear foreign language, and I didn't think it was South Korean. And the way it turned out there, we went down to 4 people from an 18, which is 1 man extra on a 17-man machine gun section. After Bobby Hallowell got killed, which was 5 from the last, Merton Good Eagle, a full-blooded Pawnee Indian, was evacuated for frozen feet and legs. That left me and 2 Pennsylvania boys. And the 3 of us walked out of the Chosin Reservoir from the 1st machine gun section. Our 2nd machine gun section, I believe, had 5 men. The 3rd machine gun section had 7. And the rifle 3 platoons was down just comparable to our machine gun sections. So there wasn't a whole lot of us left out of a company of about 227 people.
The next day, the weather cleared enough for Marine Corsairs to rejoin the battle. Their presence was felt almost immediately. After several strafing runs atop Hill 1081, the Marine pilots dropped 2 265-pound bombs on Chinese bunkers and trenches, allowing Lieutenant Colonel Schmuck's battalion to make their move. With only 2 operational bunkers remaining, Lieutenant Colonel Schmuck's Marines made their final assault on Hill 1081's crest. When Chinese soldiers refused to surrender, the Marines unleashed a barrage of grenades and automatic weapons fire. All 530 Chinese defenders were killed during the action. With their victory at Hill 1081, the Marines had stymied the Reds' last attempt to prevent their breakout from Cha-Jin. While the ground Marines had fought bravely and weathered extreme conditions, they owed a great debt to their Airedale brothers. In providing close air support for Marines on the ground, pilots risked being shot down by Chinese anti-aircraft fire. Yet in spite of these risks, Marine pilots never backed away from a chance to help their brothers on the ground. General Oliver Smith expressed this indebtedness to the brave Marine pilots in a message to General Field Harris. During the long reaches of the night and in the snowstorms, many a Marine prayed for the coming of day or clearing weather when he knew he would again hear the welcome roar of your planes. Never in its history has Marine aviation given more convincing proof of its indispensable value to ground Marines. Even after clearing the Funchilin Pass, the Marines were still left with another obstacle to overcome. As at Kotori, Chinese soldiers had blown up the bridge leading out of Funchilin. Once again, the Marine engineers would be called upon to build a treadway bridge. Air Force planes again dropped the bridge's various sections, and engineers quickly went about assembling them. After Marines enlisted the help of Chinese prisoners, the bridge was completed by 3:30 that afternoon. A few hours later, they began the arduous task of moving their vehicles across the chasm. The crossing was going smoothly until a center plywood panel buckled under a tractor's weight. Unless engineers came up with a solution quickly, the Marine column would be unable to reach Hungnam. Again, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Partridge, who served as General Smith's engineer officer, found the solution. He calculated that if the treadways were moved slightly closer together, vehicles would be able to make it across. After the modifications were completed, 1st Marine Division resumed its march. The crossing lasted all night as Marine engineers guided vehicles with flashlights. Colonel Chesty Puller was the last senior officer to leave Funchilin Pass. As his jeep filled with wounded and dead Marines crossed the gorge, Chesty Puller walked on foot. Once the entire division had made it across safely, Chief Warrant Officer Willie Harrison destroyed the bridge. From there, the Marines would have a clear path to Hungnam.
We ate breakfast at the foot of the mountain after walking all night long down this very curvy, roaded mountain. And after we ate breakfast for the mountain, then we started on toward the seacoast. We walked approximately 6 miles, and an empty convoy from the 3rd Army Division came and picked us up and took us to the railhead.
As the weary Marines reached Chung Hung Ri, they were met by transport vehicles to take them directly to Hungnam. Unfortunately, there was a shortage of vehicles and many Marines were forced to walk even further. One such Marine, PFC Robert D. DeMott, was knocked over a cliff after a Chinese explosive charge blew up. He would survive the incident and eventually make his way back to Hungnam with Korean refugees. DeMott would be the last Marine to return from the Shajian Reservoir. The first elements of 1st Marine Division began arriving at Hungnam shortly past midnight on December 12th. A few hours later, the breakout was completed successfully. The Marines had suffered 75 more dead, 16 missing, and 256 wounded since they left Kotori. For the entire campaign, 1st Marines Division had suffered a total of 4,400 casualties, with 750 dead and 1,000 stricken with frostbite. PLA 9th Army Group had paid a high price for attempting to decimate the Marines. Throughout the Shajian Reservoir campaign, Chinese forces suffered over 37,000 casualties, including 25,000 men killed from battle wounds and cold. While the Marines were temporarily out of harm's way, their journey was far from over. Over the next week, more than 105,000 soldiers, 91,000 Korean refugees, and 17,500 vehicles would be sea-lifted out of Hungnam as UN forces officially left North Korea. By December 15th, over 22,000 Marines had boarded ships sailing for Pusan.
We went down to Hungnam and got aboard a transport ship. We knew that there was mines still in the water, although we could see a lot of mines that they just got out to the edge on the land. We knew the water was icy cold. And by the way, the first thing I asked for when I got on deck of the ship was, where's the shower? I put my pack that I had confiscated up there in the reservoir, I put it under, and my rifle, I put it under a stairway. It come down from boat deck. That would be my little corner for the night, or for as long as I was going to be on the ship. The ship was a transport for 1,500 combat-equipped troops. They put over 7,000 of us on that transport to go down to Pusan, Hungnam to Pusan. At Pusan, they had a convoy. I believe it was the 7th Marine Regiment motor transport. They took us over to Mason, and there we spent 3 weeks of getting resupplied and retrained, more men, to bring in to rebuild our organization.
In the United States, Newsweek magazine proclaimed the Shajin Reservoir campaign as America's worst licking since Pearl Harbor. Even though the UNC had failed to reach the Yalu River, they triumphed in the face of extreme odds, turning sure defeat into victory. General Douglas MacArthur described the Marines' breakout from Shajin as undoubtedly one of the most successful strategic retreats in history, the most successful and satisfying I have ever commanded. Even though General MacArthur celebrated the success at Shajin Reservoir, his grand strategy to defeat the North Koreans by Christmas had failed. Worse still, he had drawn a new enemy into the war, the People's Republic of China. While China could not match America's technological superiority, they possessed a seemingly endless supply of soldiers willing to fight at a moment's notice. In a relatively short period of time, the PLA drove UN forces back across the 38th parallel, initiating a stalemate that would continue for the war's duration. Unsatisfied with President Truman's refusal to escalate the war further, General MacArthur would become increasingly disobedient over the coming months. American decision-makers now believed that they were faced with the choice of withdrawing entirely from Korea or escalating the conflict further. Escalation could bring the Soviet Union directly into the fighting and possibly trigger a third world war. During the Big Bug Out to Ham Hung, General Oliver Smith's Unified Marine Army ROK units fought 14 divisions from 4 Chinese Communist Army groups and inflicted 38,000 casualties. Since landing at Wonsan, the Marines had suffered 4,400 battle casualties, including 718 dead, 192 missing, and hundreds of cases of untreated frostbite. They left nothing behind but a battlefield strewn with Chinese corpses and useless equipment. By December 10, 1950, Marines were the only American division north of the 38th parallel with the capability and will to fight. Smith began withdrawing through Hungnam only after receiving direct orders from MacArthur. On that day, Admiral Doyle's task force began embarking 105,000 U.S. and ROK troops, 91,000 civilians, and 350,000 tons of supplies. The evacuation took 2 weeks. Relieved to see the Leathernecks go, the Chinese did not interfere. The rout of the 8th Army placed the UNC General Headquarters in a state of total panic. MacArthur dispatched a series of frantic reports to Washington, warning of the impending annihilation of the UNC. Despite the risk of further escalation, he called for direct military action against China. The use of atomic weapons was not excluded in his demand. Escalating the war appeared very dangerous to the Truman administration and the USA's allies. Seeking total victory against North Korea had already brought China into the conflict. With a very weak conventional force in Europe, the West could not risk a war with the Soviets. Even if the Soviet Union did not intervene, the USA and UNC would be immersed in a wider war in Asia that would demand a huge military commitment. In the following weeks, although still searching for a course of action, the USA hesitantly supported 2 resolutions in the UN for an immediate ceasefire. Mao rejected the resolutions. It was evident that the USA needed to find an alternative between withdrawal and escalation. In other words, a means of fighting a limited war. In a limited war, the total defeat of the opponent is not the goal. In early December, the JCS and the State Department discussions regarding fighting a limited war were very tentative. There was a great deal of uncertainty over whether the UNC could actually withstand the communist onslaught. In a press conference on November 30th, Truman stated that the USA would take any steps necessary to meet the military situation. When asked if this included the use of the atomic bomb, he replied, "There has always been active consideration of its use." Although Truman had no intention of using atomic weapons, the statement greatly frightened Western governments. The British Prime Minister Clement Attlee immediately flew to Washington for a meeting with Truman. He and the American president agreed on the need to fight a limited war and hold the UNC position in Korea as long as possible. The goal of liberating North Korea was abandoned. In a joint communique on December 8th, the 2 leaders called for negotiations with the communists. The JCS issued MacArthur a strategic directive on December 29, 1950. It stated that a decisive victory would not be sought in Korea or the People's Republic of China. MacArthur was instructed to hold his position in Korea without risking the safety of his forces. In reply, MacArthur put forth his own strategy of escalation. He called for the blockade of China, airstrikes and naval bombardment against China's industry, and the reinforcement of the 8th Army with Chinese nationalist troops. MacArthur wanted nothing less than to remove the PRC as a threat to peace in Asia for generations to come. The JCS rejected MacArthur's request. Truman personally told MacArthur to avoid actions that might cause a general war. The 8th Army commander Walton Walker died on December 23rd in a Jeep accident while touring the front. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway replaced him. A renowned airborne commander in the Second World War, Matthew Ridgway was outwardly flamboyant. For example, he always sported a grenade on his webbing. Inwardly, though, Ridgway was extremely thoughtful and perceptive. Ready to adapt to difficult circumstances, he was determined to reinvigorate the Eighth Army and stop the Communists on the ground. When Ridgway took command, the Army was still in a tactical retreat. In his first week in Korea, Ridgway toured the front line and visited nearly every division commander. The men were prone to retreating. Because units failed to keep contact with the enemy, 8th Army intelligence had no idea of the enemy's strength. Also, many of the soldiers were simply not interested in fighting. Upon taking control of the battered 8th Army, one of Ridgway's first acts was to restore soldiers' confidence in themselves. To accomplish this, he aggressively went about finding other leaders in 8th Army who were not defeatists or defensive-oriented, despite the hard knocks of November and December, and put them in charge. He was quick to reward commanders who shared his sentiments, and just as quick to relieve those officers at any level who did not. During one of his briefings in Korea, at I Corps, Ridgway sat through an extensive discussion of various defensive plans and contingencies. At the end, he asked the startled staff about the status of their attack plans. The Corps G3 operations officer responded that he had no such plans. Within days, I Corps had a new G3, and the message went out. Ridgway was interested in taking the offensive. He also replaced officers who did not send out patrols to fix enemy locations and removed enemy positions from commanders' planning maps if local units had not been in contact recently. He forcefully repeated the Army slogan, "Find them, fix them, fight them, finish them off." All these positive leadership steps had a dramatic effect immediately. Ridgway's success in turning 8th Army's morale around, using little more than a magnetic personality and bold leadership, is still a model for the Army on how the power of leadership can dramatically change a situation. Perhaps another reason he was chosen was because Ridgway was not fazed by the Olympian demeanor of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, in turn, gave Ridgway latitude in operations he had not given his predecessor. After Ridgway landed in Tokyo on Christmas Day 1950 to discuss the operational situation with MacArthur, the latter assured his new commander that the actions of 8th Army were his to conduct as he saw fit. Ridgway was encouraged to retire to successive defensive positions, as was currently underway, and hold Seoul as long as he could, but not if doing so meant that 8th Army would be isolated in an enclave around the city. In a foreshadowing of his aggressive nature, Ridgway asked specifically if he found the combat situation to my liking, whether MacArthur would have any objection to my attacking. MacArthur answered, "8th Army is yours, Matt. Do what you think best." 8th Army was in Korea to stay. In the midst of these reforms, Ridgway instituted attrition as the new operational doctrine of the 8th Army. He supported fighting a limited war and understood that warfare had changed since the Second World War. He particularly opposed the use of atomic weapons. Instead of annihilating the communists, he sought to wear down their manpower. To do so, superior UNC firepower was to be exploited to the maximum effect. The hallmark of Ridgway's doctrine of attrition was his directive to his subordinates to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing those of 8th Army. Given the communist numerical superiority, conserving casualties was critical. Not a single company was to be sacrificed. There was to be no fighting simply to hold terrain. Rather than fighting the expected communist attacks in forward positions around Seoul, Ridgway intended to withdraw carefully to the Han River. The Chinese launched the third phase offensive in sub-zero conditions on December 31, 1950. Although Ridgway was forced to abandon Seoul, his withdrawal stretched the communist supply lines to the breaking point, forcing General Peng to call off the offensive. Ridgway was anxious to seize the initiative. On January 15, 1951, he mounted a reconnaissance in force, Operation Wolfhound, followed by a full-blown offensive 10 days later, Operation Thunderbolt. In Operation Thunderbolt, the 1st and 9th Corps made a careful and step-by-step advance northward with heavy artillery and air support. The 25th U.S. Division and the Turkish Brigade pummeled the opposing 50th CPV Army in the first day of fighting. By February 9th, the 8th Army was back on the Han River. The counteroffensive surprised the CPV commanders, who had not expected such a quick UNC recovery. Overconfident, Mao ordered another attack, the short-lived and ill-advised Fourth Offensive. On February 11th, Chinese forces broke through the 3rd ROK Corps and threatened the important hub of Wangzhou. Further west, the 23rd RCT and an attached French battalion were encircled at Chipyongni. Supplied by air, they fought stubbornly and took the momentum out of the communist advance. Hoping to bring the communists to the negotiating table, Ridgway outlined a series of offensive operations based on limited objective attacks called the Meat Grinder. A limited objective attack was a concentrated and carefully prepared set-piece assault meant to kill communists and not take ground. In late February and March, Ridgway launched a series of colorfully named limited objective attacks: Operation Killer, Ripper, and Rugged. With General Smith now in command of 9th Army Corps and General Puller assuming command of the 1st Marine Division, General Ridgway decided it was time for a counteroffensive to be spearheaded by the Marines. Phase 1 of the plan was Operation Killer, an 8-day UN offensive that concluded February 28th and pushed communist forces north of the Han River. Ridgway, commanding, was dissatisfied with the results of Killer. While the operation had attained its terrain objectives and interrupted the Chinese Communist plans for an immediate major offensive, it had not caused anywhere near the amount of enemy casualties Ridgway had desired. Ground taken today can be lost tomorrow, but an enemy soldier killed today has no hope of fighting tomorrow. Ridgway wanted blood, not land. With the evidence that the Chinese were still attempting to conserve their forces and set themselves for another massive attack, Ridgway resolved to continue his own drive to the north, beating the enemy to the punch. The second phase, Operation Ripper, was intended to destroy as much of the Chinese Communist People's Volunteer Army and North Korean military around Seoul and the towns of Hongshan and Cheonghan as possible. The operation also aimed to bring UN troops to the 38th parallel. Killer was launched on March 6, 1951, with the U.S. 1st Corps and 9th Corps on the west near Seoul and Hongsong, and U.S. 10th Corps and ROK 3rd Corps in the east, to reach Line Idaho south of the 38th parallel. Ripper began with the largest artillery bombardment of the Korean War. On a cold, clear morning that quickly gave way to clouds and snow, the 1st Marine Division went into the attack, with the 7th Marine Regiment on the left and the 1st Marine Regiment on the right. As in the early stages of Operation Killer, Chinese resistance was light, confining itself to scattered small arms fire from the enemy's line of outposts. By nightfall, the day's objectives had been secured at a total cost of 7 Marines wounded. The suspicions of the first day that things were going too well were confirmed on the second. The Chinese were continuing the withdrawal they had commenced the previous month, carefully picking their fights and giving battle only to cover the withdrawal of other units. They were falling back, but they were doing it very skillfully and under control. When it was required, they were ready to put up a blistering fight in one area in order to let units withdraw from an adjacent piece of ground. Chinese resistance continued to be light and sporadic on the following day, but not so light that Charlie Company, first of the first, didn't run into a lethal hornet's nest on one of the mangled ridges before San. Sergeant John Chinner earned a Navy Cross, leading his machine gun platoon through a storm of enemy fire coming from a carefully sited cluster of well-dug-in bunkers. Single-handedly, and armed only with his .45 caliber M1911 AI pistol and a supply of captured hand grenades, Chinner stormed the ridge line through murderous fire, neutralizing 5 bunkers and either killing or forcing their occupants to flee. Darkness fell with Charlie Company in uncontested possession of the ridge. As they had done so often, the Chinese turned and pulled out. Throughout the next 2 days, Marine units devoted themselves to local patrolling, while friendly units on the right that had been outpaced by the Marine advance caught up. Then, early on 11 March, it was back to business. Faced with thousands of determined Marines, the Chinese continued to give ground and fall back to the north. Pressing forward for the next 3 days, the 1st Marine Division was well established on Operation Ripper's first major objective, Phase Line Albany. On the following day, friendly units to the west found the ravaged city of Seoul abandoned by the backpedaling enemy. During the night of March 14-15, elements of the South Korean 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division liberated Seoul, marking the 4th and last time the capital would have changed hands since June 1950. Following the recapture of Seoul, the Communist forces retreated northward, but no one expected the Chinese to abandon the fight, turn tail, and run. By the best available estimates, there were some 385,000 CCF troops in Korea, along with 120,000 North Korean soldiers, reorganizing after the beating they had absorbed the previous year and beginning to appear in action once again. They were going to require some energetic rooting out. Scarcely pausing to catch its breath on Phase Line Albany, the 1st Marines jumped off toward Hongshan and Phase Line Buffalo early on the morning of March 15th. Utilizing the rugged, muddy terrain to maximum advantage, the Communists conducted a skillful and bloody delaying action. The area was almost devoid of roads. The few that did exist were little more than ox cart trails. Dominating the whole operational area was the 2,900-foot mountain the Koreans called San. For the defender, the area was a natural stronghold. For the attacker, it was a truly nasty place. If the difficulties posed by the terrain weren't bad enough, the weather, which had been so foul throughout Operation Killer, showed no signs of improving. Corporal Austin Stack, a machine gunner in Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, remembered the period as the time of his lowest morale in Korea. Being constantly cold and wet, pelted by rain, freezing rain, sleet, and snow, and slogging wearily through a mixture of half-frozen boot-top deep snow, mud, and slush can dim the spirits of the most cheerful optimist and give pause to even the most determined masochist. Despite these obstacles, Operation Ripper pressed on throughout March. Thousands of Korean porters, utilizing the A-frame carrying rack which had been used to transport heavy burdens since the beginnings of Korea, labored up and down the nearby vertical landscape, delivering ammunition, rations, and fuel to the frontline units. Korean peasants routinely manhandled forward loads of 100 pounds and more to keep the advance moving. Cargadores, they were called officially, Marines in the ranks ever quick to borrow from the local language, dubbed them the Yobo train, from the Korean word for the carrying device they mounted their loads upon. By whatever name, they were invaluable. By one means or another, the advance kept moving. Evidence that it was disrupting Chinese plans for a fighting withdrawal came in the form of an intercepted radio communication early on 15 March. "We cannot fight any longer. We must move back today. We will move back at 1400 hours. Enemy troops will enter our position at 1300 or 1400. Enemy troops approaching fast." Late that afternoon, the lead elements of Major Webb D. Sawyer's 1st of the 7th entered Hongshan without a fight. It was a different story north of Hongshan, where for the next 3 days, the Chinese fought bitterly, battling for every lump and bump in the ground. The 1st Marines on the right had their hands full, with Chinese fighting from a succession of skillfully sited bunkers and trenches. In a series of bloody hand-to-hand encounters, up close and personal, Marines had to shoot, blast, and burn the defenders from their strongholds. On the infrequent occasions when the weather lifted, the treetop-level strikes of Marine close air support provided the element that turned the tables. The 1st Marine Division's running gun battles with the Chinese continued to follow the pattern of alternately fighting and withdrawing. Slowly but surely, however, the Chinese were being forced backward, until on March 20th the advance had reached Phase Line Buffalo. Before darkness fell, the 5th Marines, with the 1st Marines on the right and aided by deadly accurate airstrikes by Marine fighter squadrons, overran the Chinese main line of resistance. It was the KMC regiment that ran up against the heaviest fighting in the advance to Operation Ripper's final objective, Phase Line Cairo. Sandwiched between the 5th and the 1st Marines, the Korean Marines worked their way through the tortuous jumble of ridges, gullies, and ravines that fronted Hill 975. Battling pocket after pocket of resistance in a continuing rattle and crash of point-blank fire, punctuated by the detonation of grenades and mortar rounds, they moved on. Supplied by airdrops and ably supported by Lieutenant Colonel William McReynolds' 3rd Battalion 11th Marines, firing in direct support, they slugged their way forward until the issue was decided. Hongshan was taken on the 15th and Cheongkon secured on the 22nd. The capture of Cheongkon was the last major ground objective of Operation Ripper. All the objectives of Operation Ripper were now controlled by the 8th Army, which had been attacking continuously since February 21st. Still, with the evidence mounting that the CCF had not abandoned plans for a major offensive, General Ridgway wanted to find a way to keep the pressure on. MacArthur now had a clear victory, and he wanted to destroy the bridges over the Yalu to prevent the CCF from bringing more troops and supplies into Korea. To accomplish that, he would now have to battle the President of the United States.